Hey, I just wanted to make a quick video on the scribing system and go over my early impressions on it and whether or not I actually like the system or not. The system overall is pretty good and adds a lot of build variety and some cool unique skills. However, there's a lot of really weird interactions with it that don't just seem to line up at all. Most of this video is going to be unscripted, however some of the more specific things about skills will be scripted as they are very important to discuss. The first thing I want to go over is the buffs, as it really doesn't work out for a DPS because of the timer. Most of the buffs are 10 seconds while most of the dots are 22, 20, and sometimes 15 seconds long. The problem with this system is if the dots are too strong, it will replace basically everything on your bar with a scribing skill, and I doubt they want that to happen. However, with the current system, using a buff on any of the dots is meaningless, as you just basically have to recast it early or recast it for the buff late. And at that point, having a buff on the skill is kind of just pointless, as you'll get better uptimes with someone else doing it or the usual way we do it now. The best example of this is the vault skill from the bow skill line. With this skill we can apply Lingering Torment, which is a 20-second damage over time, and we can add a buff to this skill. If we do both of these, yes, we'll have a dot and a buff, but the buff only lasts 10 seconds like Minor Force. If we're going to do that, we're better off just using Trap Beast or Velothi anyway. A good example of a skill worth using is the Throwing Knife skill, as it's probably going to be a pretty good spammable for a lot of classes, and it can give a decent list of buffs. However, most people will probably just use Major Savagery and Prophecy. I honestly believe the reason behind the 10-second timers on all the buffs is so that they don't take over the main source of that buff. However, in most optimized groups, if you have a buff, it's already close to 100% uptime anyway. These seem to just be used to fill in the gaps if someone is missing a buff, or even honestly, if you're in an unoptimized group, most of these skills will probably be pretty broken. There's really only 3 skills I'm looking at right now, as the 4th one being Shield Throw. I don't sword board tank very often, so I probably will not end up using this all that much, though there are some funny combinations with it. You can check out Hyper's video for that. For me, however, I'm looking into really only the 2 skills from Soul Magic, Wield Soul and Soul Burst, and the Mage's Guild skill Contingency. Starting off with Wield Soul, the only reason you'd ever use this skill is because it's a good Magicka pull. Starting off with the signature scripts, most of the signature scripts on this skill are really good, however there's only one that I'm going to be looking at. Druid's Resurgence is the one script I'm looking at. It gives 1000 magic and stamina, and while that's not all that much on its own, mixing the skill with a couple of reduced cost glyphs, you can actually make the skill almost free, and it's just 1000 stamina every time you cast it. Almost all of the affixes are good, and power is kind of meh, as on the tank your heavy attack damage doesn't really matter. However, things like Cowardice and Vitality are very good for a tank. Overall, I'll probably mostly be looking at Vitality, as it gives the most for your value, but if you really need the Major Cowardice and you don't have a Nightblade, it is a good source of it. Overall, I think the skill I'm going to be running with Wield Soul is making it a pull, adding Druid's Resurgence, and probably picking Major Vitality over Major Cowardice. However, you can basically do whatever you want. I do heavily recommend Druid's Resurgence, as you can make the skill free and give you 1000 stamina at the same time. On to the next skill, Soul Burst. Soul Burst is an instant cast AoE around you. Soul Burst is quite a hefty damage shield, and that's going to be the main focus I use on this skill. As for the signatures, there's really a lot of good options. What I'm probably going to be running is Class Mastery. There's a list of all of them and what they do on Skinny Cheeks' Google Sheet that I'll link in the description. You can just make a copy of it and then look at it on your own. But for the most part, the DK one's really good. The Arcanist one would probably be one I don't use, as one Crux generation is kind of terrible, considering your taunt does that for you, and Crux Weaver armor. However, on a Arcanist, you also don't really need the damage shield, as their main damage shield is also pretty much insane, and there's not much more you need than that. The Purge is an interesting option, however, the skill's quite expensive, and using the skill to only purge one negative effect when it could also just purge the wrong negative effect too that you want, so you have to hit it again and again until you get the right one. It's a little too expensive for that. However, it is a decent option if you want to use it. For the affixes, the Interrupt is funny. We were messing around with it on PTS for a little bit, and just running into a group of enemies and spamming it in AoE trash packs is hilarious, though it's not generally all that useful. What I'm going to be using the skill for is Minor Intellect and Minor Endurance, as the only real source of that nowadays is Xena's and Enchanted Growth, and most of the time with the new fights, the tank isn't necessarily in range of Enchanted Growth, so for the most part, that's a a really viable source of minor intellect and endurance. Overall, this is a very good group damage shield, and if you want to, you can also throw a minor courage on this to give the entire group minor courage, but if you have an Arcanist support, Xena's is almost always going to be used, so the minor courage isn't necessarily the best option there. On to the last skill I want to heavily talk about, which is Contingency. For the longest time when we were doing PTS stuff, I didn't actually know how this skill worked because I'm stupid and didn't read the description of it. Now that I actually read its tooltip, making the skill actually function how I wanted it to became a lot easier, and it's a lot better than I thought it was. For me, I'm going to use the damage shield focus, as it's another AoE direct damage shield thing. It just applies a decently sized damage shield to all of your allies every time it pops. In conjunction with the last skill, you can give people basically barriers every couple seconds. As for the signature scripts, the only one as a tank that I'm ever going to use is Gladiator's Tenacity, that reduces damage taken by 8%. That's just way too good to not have. If you don't want to do that or are a healer, you can also use Growing Impact, which we found gives minor vulnerability pretty well. It's kind of cool that you can do that. And for the affixes, minor vulnerability exists. You can give minor protection to everyone hit by the damage shield, or minor force if for whatever reason you want to do that. I don't know why you would. But for the most part, I think most people will go with minor protection for 10 seconds, as this skill is extremely cheap for the most part, and if you just run into a group of enemies with it procced already, you can pop it beforehand, run in, pop something else, and it will give everyone minor protection and a damage shield. So one of the combinations that we found while testing stuff in the new trial was mixing the damage shield from Contingency and the damage shield from Soul Burst. Doing this will give everyone around you a 20-ish K damage shield, giving them minor protection and whatever else you put on Soul Burst, which is insane. There was also a entire minute-long 3-paragraph segment here about Vault, but Hyper already made a video about this, and I think they fixed it in the latest patch for the PTS, but you could vault out of the map basically anywhere you wanted, which was kind of hilarious, but it's been fixed now, so, no fun. One last skill I want to talk about is Elemental Explosion. We were messing around with it for AoE off balance and instant proccing, burning, chilled, concussed, and overcharged, but with most trial groups you already have all of this pre-made for AoE anyway. Moving it all to one skill is kind of cool, but in the long run it's not really worth it, as it has a 2-second channel, so you'd have to be able to pre-place it pretty easily, and the way this skill works, it's just not really viable right now. That's all I really wanted to talk about for the time being, as most of the other skills have some cool stuff, but I'm too lazy to really figure out anything with it, and at this point I've kind of resigned to just tanking everything, and most of the other skills don't affect me too much. The bow having a taunt is hilarious and going to be super annoying in PvE when you're just running with random people and some dude with a bow is like, hey, that boss, I'm going to take it, and then he yells at you for not taunting it, but that's kind of not my problem anymore. But if you want to look at any of these skills and do some quick math or whatever and figure out what you want to do, I will link Skinny Cheeks' videos and spreadsheet in the description. Just make a copy of it and start editing it, click on stuff. I don't know, you can do what you want with it, I don't really care. But that's all. I'm hoping this video is not as long as what this recording says, but we'll see.